Um, I'm going to pick up where Tim left off, and I'm going to be talking about FDA's role in rare diseases, drug development, the legislation and policies that we have, and some recent history for orphan drugs. So this is a very high, broad overview of drug development, very broad, and I'm just providing this as some background. Over here to the right is basic science. That's really where it all begins. That can go on for years, maybe forever, but some promising agents then would move forward into what we call translational science. Translational science is very broad, encompasses a lot of things. For example, this is where we would really do a lot of work on understanding a disease, registries, natural history studies, finding the fit between a potential drug and the target that we're going after, for example, and things like animal models of disease. That would all fit in the translational space. Then moving forward from there, in pre-IND phase, that would be right before you're planning on moving into clinical trials. That would be things like animal toxicology studies, for example. And this whole piece there can take, estimated from 5 to 10 years, but really it's very highly variable depending on what you're talking about. This is really kind of the scientific foundation before you would then begin testing in people, the clinical phase. And that's roughly divided into phase 1, 2, and 3, and that again can take 5 to 10 years. It's really very variable, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more. And right towards the end of that, that would be the NDA, BLA, where all that's known about a drug, its exposure in people, the clinical trials are done. At that point, it would come in for FDA review, and then a decision would be made about approving or having it available for commercial use. Next. So this is where people tend to fit in, although once again, this is very high level. NIH traditionally has been down in the basic science, a lot of bench research, and more recently there's the NIH TREND program, that's the Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases program, and also Steve's office, Steve Groff's office of Rare Disease Research. They tend to do a lot of work in that translational phase. FDA has typically, traditionally been involved right at the point where you're going into clinical trials. That's usually where FDA gets involved, much farther down. But more recently, again, we've had what we call our critical path, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a little while. And drug developers can really fit in anywhere along here. Sometimes the larger pharmaceuticals, for example, have their own basic science in-house. Some of the smaller companies may be involved around, but really anywhere along. And what I'm trying to show a little bit is this translational phase has traditionally as well been a little bit less active than the two bookends, if you will. Another way of thinking of translational medicine, if we use a crude analogy of building a house, for example, down here in the basic science would be you're drawing your blueprints, you're putting together your architectural plans. The clinical phases would be putting up the walls and putting your furniture, making the house livable. This translational phase would be digging the foundation, pouring the concrete, putting in the pipes and the electricity. So all the things that really are the foundational work, the structural integrity, and this is very important work that will then support clinical trials later on. Again. And I'm showing here where an IND or an investigational new drug application, this is when you're going into clinical trials. You need to open an IND to then begin testing in humans, and the NDA BLA comes in towards the end. One more time. And these are opportunities for interaction with FDA, which I'll touch on a little bit as well. But these are what's called milestone meetings. We have the pre-NDA, where you can meet before you submit your IND, end of phase 1. That's for serious or life-threatening diseases. End of phase 2, that's usually an important meeting. You're making decisions about how to design those pivotal trials that could support approval. And then pre-NDA or pre-BLA before you come in with your marketing application. There can be other meetings, but these are what's called milestone meetings. So that's just a little bit of background. Next slide, please. Tim's gone over a lot of this, and I'll just highlight a few things. As Tim said, Orphan Drug Act provides mainly incentives. It does not tell how to conduct trials or how to do drug development programs, and it has been very successful, as Tim said. And I just want to point out about 90% of the orphan approvals are in the Center for Drugs. The remaining 10% are in Center for Biologics, so they would have blood, vaccines, cellular and genetic therapies, and we have everything else. It's a little misleading. Center for Drugs also has the therapeutic biologic products such as the enzymes that were mentioned. Next, please. When we're talking about rare diseases, although the Orphan Drug Act says less than 200,000 people, the reality is we're normally talking about many fewer patients than that. Most of the diseases are clustered down here in very low prevalence disorders, 20,000 patients or much less. This bar here, that's 10,000 or less, and that's most of the diseases we're talking about. So that's where most of the designations are, and also most of the approvals. Next slide, please. So if the Orphan Drug Act does not give us guidelines for how to conduct trials, how to review them, we look to other legislation and existing initiatives, and I'm just going to name a few of these. None of these are exclusive to the orphans except the Orphan Drug Act. They are applicable to serious life-threatening disorders and unmet medical needs. But this is in the regulation, and this says that FDA is required to exercise flexibility and scientific judgment because we see so many different diseases and so many different drugs and so many different population sizes, and so this really does apply to the orphans. And it says there are many kinds of drugs that are subject to the statutory standards for approval, and the wide range of uses for those drugs demands flexibility in applying the standards. And FDA is required to exercise its scientific judgment to determine the kind and quantity of data and information an applicant is required to provide for a particular drug. And this is very important. We come back to this all the time, and this is really the underpinnings of how we're able to review and to approve orphan drugs. Next, please. So what else is there? Well, there's other legislation. Again, it's not exclusive to orphans, but we use this all the time. FDAMA, or Food and Drug Modernization Act in 1997, that came about during the HIV epidemic, where the perception was that drug development was moving too slowly. And that brought in a few programs, and I'll explain some of them. Fast Track designation. That is a designation given to the drug for a disease that is serious and has an unmet need. And the purpose here is to allow greater interactions. Those meetings I showed before, what that does is it opens up more meetings, the possibility of, for example, an end of phase 2 meeting. And this is because we know that greater engagement, greater interaction actually leads to greater success in getting drugs through to approval. Accelerated approval, that would be an approval that is based on a surrogate. Surrogates are often laboratory measures or imaging measures, rather than what a full approval or a traditional approval where it would be based on a clinical benefit to a patient. That is something that a patient would feel or having to do with how they function or survive, such as survival, for example. So this allows for an approval based on a surrogate or an endpoint other than whatever is the major morbidity or survival. So this is used very frequently in HIV, for example, where an approval would be based on decreasing the viral load in the blood, maybe imperceptible to a patient, but we know that that predicts a better outcome. Or cancer, for example, where you see progression-free survival. You're seeing that the tumor is either decreasing or not progressing as opposed to a survival outcome. And then priority review, that is a timeline. When an application for marketing is submitted, FDA has 10 months to approve it or make a decision for a standard review. Priority reviews are for those that appear to offer a significant improvement over existing therapies, and then the review timeline is 6 months. So most of the orphan drugs are actually priority reviews. Next, please. Some other important initiatives, expanded access. That is also called compassionate use. That is when you can make an experimental agent available to someone with a serious life-threatening illness who perhaps has exhausted all possibilities. Last year, in 2010, we had over 1,000 of these in Center for Drugs. The overwhelming majority of these are granted. Critical Path Initiative, which we mentioned earlier. These are exploring ways for innovation, things like biomarkers, which are laboratory measures. Tim had mentioned the lock and the key. These would be looking for signals that tip us off earlier that the drug is working, does what we want it to do, or to help speed clinical development. or things, there's been a lot of talk about clinical trial designs, alternate designs. Can you adapt as you move along? So that would fall under critical path, although it does have a number of other things. There's also the CEDAR Rare Diseases Program, which is my program that started about 2 years ago, and we exist only to try to facilitate, accelerate, and support rare disease development, and that's due to expand under PDUFA 5, which is due to be enacted a year from now. Next, please. I'll just highlight some of our success. Since 2006, there have been over 85 approvals for orphan drugs for about 60 different indications. And what is very remarkable here is that when we looked back over the programs, 75% of these are what we call non-traditional study designs. Either they rely on one study or something else, something other, use historical controls rather than, for example, a placebo comparator. Or for the bioterrorism drugs that Tim mentioned, these can be done under animal rule. You would never expose a human to plutonium, for example, but this could be done in animals. And only about 25% of those are based on what is the traditional 2 randomized controlled trials. Next, please. Here's our approvals in the past 3 years, and just highlighting here that we've had 22 orphans so far this year. We're having a good year. And next slide. And for this year, calendar year 2011, so far there have been 27 new molecular entities. These are drugs that never before approved, so this is innovative. This is new, not available to patients before, or new biologics. And so far in CEDAR, there's been 27, and 10 of those are in rare diseases. So as Tim said before, about a third of these, a little bit more, are coming in the orphans. So this is where a lot of the very innovative new compounds are coming from. Next, please. And this is just a snapshot this year of the types of things that have been approved, and I'm really trying to highlight the diversity here. It's really in just about every therapeutic area, very wide variety, and about a third of these, again, a little bit more, are the cancers. Next, please. So just to summarize then, FDA has a very long-standing commitment to the orphans, and particularly those that are serious, life-threatening, and with unmet medical needs. This is a very active area of research. It's increasing, and we expect that to continue. It's accelerating. It takes up a big portion of our work, and it's a very important area to us. Conducting clinical development is feasible. It's not easy. It requires a lot of engagement, a lot of resources, a lot of back and forth with drug developers, and we are committed to doing this. And these rare disease applications are characterized by incredible therapeutic regulatory diversity, and many are groundbreaking and novel. So I'll stop there. Thank you.